Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. It was 1871, and Dry Creek wasn't so much a town as a collection of stubbornness nailed together. Buildings leaned like tired men. A clapboard hotel with 3 rooms and 2 beds. A livery that smelled of hot iron and manure. A general store where everything came with dust included. The new rail spur had coughed up a boxcar of gamblers and drifters the week before, then steamed on, leaving behind a jumble of ambitions to sort themselves out. Thomas Avery rode in at noon behind his mule, a scarred gray he'd traded for outside. Fort Craig. The sun had chewed lines into his face, and 4 years wearing a sky-blue coat had left their own marks you couldn't see. He'd brought little bedroll, rifle, a coffee pot banged thin from campfires, and a leather pouch that clinked softly when he walked. Every clink was a decision he hadn't yet made. The saloon's swinging doors sighed when he pushed through. Inside, the light was cut into gold ribbons by slats of shade. A piano stood quiet as a coffin. Lace curtains drooped from a window that had never known lace. Nettie behind the bar polished the same glass as if it held answers. She looked up at him with that frontier measure. Are you trouble, or are you just tired? Tired, Thomas said to the look, and laid a nickel on the plank. Water for the mule. Coffee for me. You want coffee with your dust, or dust with your coffee? She asked, but there was a small smile. She poured thick black into a chipped cup and snapped her fingers to a boy to tend the mule out back dot at the rail. A man in a salt-stiff duster swayed ever so slightly, his hat brim sagging like a wilted leaf. Cal McBride had the red, raw nose of a man who treated whiskey like a friend and an inheritance. Cards lay scattered in front of him. A pair of ranch hands, a telegraph man in shirt-sleeves, and a gambler with sleeve garters sharp as a knife and just as forgiving were his audience. I'll do it, McBride was saying to the roomette, large, voice lubricated by liquor and the need to be heard. I swear on the grave of every steer I never branded. $22. That's what my spread's worth. The whole cussed lot. House, well, windmill, and whatever cattle the buzzards. Ain't finished. $22. They laughed because that kind of talk begets laughter. But the gambler Devereaux, by the cards, tapped ash off a cigarette and glanced toward Thomas, who was counting sips of coffee like a man counts heartbeats. You hear that, soldier? Land for less than a week at a card table. Some luck you bring with you. Thomas set down the cup and wiped his mouth on his sleeve. He had been a soldier long enough that the words slid off him without noise. He loosened the drawstring of his pouch and felt the familiar edges under his fingers. $1 $20 double eagle and $2 silver. He remembered the sequence of things that had delivered them to him. Nights hauling rails for the Army's contractors. A winter of cutting firewood for a missionary who underpaid but paid on time. A horse he'd shod for a rancher panicked by an early storm. Show me what $22 buys, Thomas said. McBride squinted, incredulous, then grinned. It buys me out from under a curse, that's what. Nettie snorted. It buys you a drunk's breakfast for a week. Cal, don't go swindling a stranger before he's finished his coffee. Thomas tipped the coins into his palm and laid them on the table one by one. Gold that caught the light like sunrise, silver that chimed softly. The room quieted. Devereaux's eyebrows climbed. The telegraph man swallowed. The deed? Thomas asked. McBride looked briefly aggrieved, like a coyote caught in its own trap. Then he slapped his coat, came up empty, and slapped the other. Sighed. Paper. I got paper. He seized a whiskey bill from the bar, licked the end of a pencil, and began to scratch. It wasn't quite writing so much as wrestling with letters. He got his name right more or less, and the phrase Cal McBride's Ranch, and something like a description of boundaries, from the big red rock to the crooked cottonwood down the wash. "Need a witness," Devereux murmured. He flicked his cigarette, signed his own name with the easy flourish of a man who'd practiced signing other people's, then slid the makeshift deed toward Nettie. She sighed, added N. Pollard, and the date. McBride palmed the gold with one hand and the silver with the other, a juggler whose act was money and mistakes. There, buyer beware and all that. He bared his teeth. Mind the girl. What girl? Thomas asked. McBride's grin went slack. Something ugly flickered through it and was gone. Kidding, he said, too quickly. He swept the coins into his pocket and stood, finding his balance like a man remembers a prayer he hasn't said in years. You can ride out before the heat makes fools of us all. Head west, follow Dry Creek till it forks under the red bluffs. You'll know the place. House faces south. Windmill screams when it's thirsty. Cal, Nettie said softly. It wasn't quite a question. He hardened at the sound of his name. What? A man can sell what's his? Devereux lifted a shoulder. A man can, yes. Whether he ought. T.O. is separate arithmetic. He looked at Thomas. You really mean to keep it? Land's land, Thomas said. He folded the whiskey bill deed and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, against his chest, where important things go when you don't have a desk or a drawer. And I'm tired of sleeping where other men tell me. Suit yourself. McBride sang, already halfway to another bottle. Only a fool buys a ranch for $22, or a prophet. We'll see which. Outside, the street simmered. Thomas collected his mule and his coffee in the same motion, drained the cup, and handed it back to Nettie as she stepped into the light. She squinted at him, eyes pale as sun on water. You got any friends out there? She asked. Not yet. Take. Water, she said, and pressed a full canteen into his hand. And don't trust Cal more than you trust a rattler to mind your baby. Thomas nodded and untied the mule. He paused, feeling the weight of the folded deed. Between two heartbeats, he saw himself as a younger man in a blue coat standing on a ridge while cannon thundered, how you could claim a hill and keep it only so long as your men could hold a line. Land wasn't just earth. It was choosing to stay dot he chose. The road west unraveled like a frayed rope. Dry Creek ran to his right, a thin, reluctant thread working through beds of cobble. Mesquite strained from the soil in ragged clumps. Ocotillo speared the sky. Prickly pear held the sun on their backs like they were shouldering a burden for the rest of the world. Buzzards rode the thermals, black punctuation against a hard blue sentence of sky. He rode at a mule's pace steady, unpersuaded. As the town fell behind, the world widened and the sounds changed. Planks giving under boots became gravel under hooves. The clink of bottles became a hawk's cry. Now and again he saw a sign. A wheel track sunk deep, 2 sets of boot prints that drifted toward the hills, a scrap of calico snagged on a catclaw thorn. The wind smelled of creosote and old smoke. Asterisk by mid-afternoon, the land broke open into a shallow basin. Red sandstone bluffs rose on the far rim, like folded blankets. A cottonwood, warped by years of wind and lightning, forked over the wash exactly where McBride had said it would. Thomas reined in and shaded his eyes. A structure hunched close to the earth, half a mile ahead. A house built low and wide against the sun, roof shingles missing in a checkerboard, a windmill skeleton stabbing at the sky. The pump's vanes creaked and fell silent, then creaked again. As if remembering the motion dot closer, the signs of neglect multiplied. Fence posts leaned or simply lay down where they'd fallen. A gate hung off one hinge and had decided to stay that way out of spite. The corral was beaten earth and old manure with the ghost of hooves pressed into it, the kind of ghost that fades when the next rain comes, which hadn't been soon. Asterisk his mule balked at the threshold of the yard, ears tilting like weathercocks. Thomas patted its neck, slid from the saddle, and looped the reins loosely over a post that didn't look offended by the duty. The water trough had a skin on it, a green film that wrinkled when he touched it with a finger. He'd seen worse. He cranked the windlass and brought up a bucket from the well, the rope rasping like a dry throat. The water was cool and clean. The mule drank until its sides eased. Thomas let the bucket clatter down gently and turned to the house. The front door stood ajar, but not welcoming. A blackened ring on the hardpan said a cook fire had burned itself out sometime days ago. A tin plate lay face down in the dust, a fork beside it. He stepped up onto the porch, feeling each board announce him. With a tired groan, his hand found the revolver at his belt and rested there without drawing. He didn't call out. The land was listening too loud. Inside, the air was stale, the way a church feels after an all-night vigil where no God showed. The first room was everything: kitchen, parlor, sleeping space. A narrow table had been shoved sideways and left that way. A chair lay on its back, like a knocked-out fighter. A Bible sat open on a shelf with grit in its gutters. Boots 2 pairs waited by the door, patient as dogs. A third, smaller pair of moccasins under a peg, the kind of detail a man notices without wanting to. He moved slow, the way he had when he'd searched farmhouses after the war for a boy gone missing or a powder cache waiting to turn it careless. Hand into smoke. Glass crunched under his heel, and the soft whisper of a curtain, stirring though no window was open. He lifted his lantern from his saddlebag and coaxed flame to wick. The light shook and steadied. It painted the room in truth. Scuffs near the hearth where something heavy had been dragged. A black crescent on the wall where a lantern had soothed a long night. A crust of coffee in a kettle that had been abandoned mid-morning or mid-fear. Lantern found the next door, a rough plank cut into the wall that led to what passed for a bedroom. The hinges squealed, thin and complaining. Thomas stepped through. The smell changed in that doorway, and for the rest of his life, whenever he caught the faintest drift of it, he would stop whatever he was doing and stand very still without meaning to. The room was small. A rope bed with ticking slumped in it. A trunk at the foot, a narrow window curtain laid with flour sackcloth. And there, from a beam ribbed with old axe marks, hung a body. She was no more than 16-18, if you wanted to give the world the benefit of the doubt. Her hair, black and heavy, had been braided and bound with a strip of red cloth that had slipped loose and now brushed her shoulder. Her bare feet were inches above the plank floor. A beaded necklace lay crooked on her collarbone. The lantern made the beads glow like tiny stars caught in a net. Thomas stopped breathing, not in shock so much as refusal. He had seen death in forms that taught a man to read it quickly, to file it where he could find it later. This was a new chapter in a book he didn't want to own. He set the lantern on the trunk, because his hands weren't quite steady, and because you don't put light on the floor like you don't sit at a table without first removing your hat. He looked at her face peaceful in a way that is not peace, and then he looked away because looking felt like taking something from her. The knot around her neck had been tied by a hand that knew knots. The rope over the beam had been thrown. With care, then hauled. Her wrists, he saw it and wished he hadn't bore the raw shine of rope that had been too tight for too long. A bruise, thumb wide, marked her jaw. None of that belonged with a girl in a quiet room on a quiet ranch out Apache, he thought. The beadwork, the cut of the dress homespun, and altered with loving patience the moccasins by the door. Around Dry Creek, ranchers used the word Apache like some men use a curse and some men use a prayer. Thomas used it like a fact. He knew just enough to know he didn't know enough about wind pushed at the flour sack curtain, and the curtain pushed back, and the room breathed once around him. He could hear his mule outside crop at a weed, hear the windmill complain, hear the hush that runs ahead of a hawk's shadow. In that hush, he felt something like a verdict being delivered. He swallowed. His throat didn't want to work. He didn't touch the rope. He didn't touch her. There is a kind of respect that begins where your hands end. He stepped backward into the main room, because forward was nowhere to go. He scanned the floor again with the lantern. A strand of hair, the same black as her braid lay draped over a splinter near the table, caught there by chance. Boot prints crowded each other near the door, some old and soft at the edges, some newer, pressed deep with the authority of men who come as if they own any place they enter. A child's moccasin print sat alone by the hearth. Half a moon stamped an ash dot outside. A coyote yipped and was answered. Thomas thought of the coins changing hands, of McBride's tongue stumbling over the word girl, of the way Devereux's eyes had watched the room rather than the money. He thought of the folded deed against his chest, of land and lines and claims, of ownership and what it means to own a place where such a thing had been done. He lifted the lantern and went to the threshold, meeting air. The sky had shifted from brass to hammered copper. The red bluffs on the horizon were bleeding their color into the wash below. He stood there with his hand on the door jamb and felt the house lean into him a little, as if it had been trying to stand upright alone for too long. Somewhere between the creek and the cottonwood, a horse snorted. He turned his head. Nothing moved that he could see, but the feeling of being watched slid along his spine like a blade laid flat. The land was full of eyeshawk, coyote, lizard, and maybe more. He went back inside and lowered the lantern flame to a calmer glow. He sat at the edge of the table where the grit would not grind under his elbows and set his revolver beside his hand. He did not take his hat off. He stared at the doorway to the bedroom and listened to the house hum and settle. He told himself he would keep vigil until the sun was all the way gone, and after that he would do what the dead require of the living. His mouth formed the words without sound. This was no suicide. He kept the first watch for the dead the way he'd kept it for the living, eyes open, back straight, rifle within reach. The lantern's wick hissed down to a coal, and the window went from iron to pewter to the pale bone of morning. When the light was strong enough to be honest, Thomas stood. He took his hat off in the bedroom. It felt necessary. "I don't know your name," he said to the girl, not whispering and not loud. "I'll try not to do anything wrong." He looped his army-issue knife through the rope with careful strokes, catching her weight with his shoulder. When the strands gave, she was light, lighter than she should have been, which told its own story. He cut the binding at her wrists and laid her on the ticking, pulled a blanket crosswise to cover what modesty demands, even after modesty has no claimant. His hands moved like he was back in a field hospital where the surgeon said, "Hold him," and then did what had to be done. There were marks. Whoever did this had not been in a hurry and had not been generous. He looked long enough to be sure, then stopped looking. The necklace, small white beads alternating with darker ones, had a broken strand. He gathered the fallen beads with his big fingers and tucked them into a fold of cloth. A strip of red that had tied her braid he set aside like a ribbon you keep from a wedding you couldn't attend. Outside, the wind had found its voice. It rattled the loose shingle, tugged at the pump's vanes until the windmill creaked alive, and shoved dust across the yard in low whispers. He fetched the shovel from the porch, its blade nicked from years of caliche, and walked out past the cottonwoods toward a rise where the earth was soft enough to be persuaded. From the bedroom window, the girl could see the spot. That seemed right. He dug until the blisters broke open where old ones had scarred, until the lean line of morning stretched toward the rim of the basin and the sweat under his shirt turned cold. When he stopped to breathe, he let his eyes rest on the bluff that held the horizon like a dam holds back a river. You work, the land stands. That's the arrangement. He made a litter from 2 fence rails and his bedroll. He carried her out quiet, the way one carries a sleeping child. He paused at the door and looked back because leaving a room for the last time is a kind of theft. At the grave, he slid her down and straightened the blanket. Words wouldn't come for a long breath. When they came, the shape of them surprised him. In the war we said over a man, you did all that you could. I don't know if that's true for you. I don't know who should be speaking here. I'm the one that's here. He drew a long breath past a hitch in his chest. You'll get a marker. You'll get more than that if I can manage it. He filled the grave. It always takes longer than you think. The dirt never wants to go back the way it came. He brought stones from the wash and built a low cairn, 3 wide at the base, then 2, then 1. He tied the red strip to a stick and pushed it into the mound, not as a flag, no one owns the dead, but as a way of saying, this is not nothing. Back at the house, he washed his hands at the bucket and watched the red clay run away in lines. Only then did he follow the sign dot in the yard. The story lay open if you could read. Thomas had learned to read the ground from an old scout near the Cimarron who'd spoken little English and less nonsense. Here, 2 horses had stood quivering. At reins tied to the porch post not for long, and they were wet when they came in, else the sweat dark would not show on the boards like spilled coffee. A 3rd horse had circled, the rider staying mounted, impatient enough to leave a gouge where a hoof pawed. 1 shoe had a missing nail that made a telltale notch. Every few feet the print bit deep on the outer edge. The rider who stayed mounted spit tobacco and favored the left rein. The spit marked one side of the step, and the bit marks on the rail were chewed shallow dash left dot boots. 3 sets, big men who didn't bother with sneaking. One had half soles tacked down rough. The edges had ripped and left a little crescent in the heel mows. I'll call you, he thought, because a boot like that belongs to a man who answers to a short name. Another set dragged the right foot a hair. The toe scuffed inside the print rucker. Maybe. The last set walked straight and planted hard. That one had stood squared to the door, in and out, and left the cleanest tracks because he carried the least uncertainty. Holt, the tracks said, though Thomas didn't yet have a name. Someone like that, anyway, not just men. By the hearth, a soft half-moon of a moccasin had pressed the ash, small, then another turned outward, then gone. Not toward the door. Toward the back wall, where the floorboard seam was wider than its neighbors. Thomas knelt, ran his thumb along the gap, and felt where nails had been lifted and set down again. He pried at the far board with his knife and eased it up dot inside the dark. A little bundle rested, the size of a fist, wrapped in tanned deer hide and tied with sinew. He did not open it. Some things have edges you can't see. He replaced the board and tamped it with his palm. If there was a living owner of that bundle, they would want it where it was. If there wasn't, then he could think on it later. He followed the horse sign west, toward the shoulder of the basin where mesquite crowded into dense knots and the wash braided itself into small channels. He moved with the sun at his back, keeping to shade when it offered itself. Crows heckled from a cottonwood, and a lizard skittered under a flat rock like a thin thought dot at the fork where Dry Creek split around an islet of stone. The tracks divided. 2 riders had taken the low route through the sand, prints clean as writing. The 3rd notch shoe had led his horse up the shoulder and back down, scouting. He'd stopped where the ground fell away and looked back toward the ranch house. The toes pointed home. Thomas squinted and lifted his hand to shade his eyes. In the distance the house crouched small and square, the windmill a stilled cross. Against the sky, he felt the hair on his arms lift. Enough, he said aloud. A man alone can end up talking to the world so much he forgets it's not talking back. He turned toward the house. You don't go far from a place that's a promise, even a bad promise. They came as the sun got its heat under it, 3 men riding. As if they had always been 3 and didn't know how to ride any other way. Front man with his shoulders set, 2 flanking him like parentheses. Dust puffed up under their mounts' hooves. The lead horse, a tall buckskin, carried a saddle with new leather skirts and a silver concho that had seen more rubbing than the rest. The man astride, it had a face like a knife that had skipped. A whetstone. Scar along the jawline. Pale hair at the temples, though the rest was black. When he smiled, only one side bothered. Morning, he said. Fine piece of ground you got here. Came with the windmill, Thomas said, not returning the smile. Windmill talk to you if you listen long enough. Name's Holt. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat in greeting that was not quite a greeting. The one on his right broad, with heavy hands and a nose gone 3 directions, snorted. The other, thin with an apple core of a face, collected dust in the seams of his grin and seemed obliged to show them off. Holt, Thomas repeated, and watched. He watched how the flanking men's eyes never left his hands. He watched where? Their rifles sat in the scabbard's latches open. He watched how Holt's horse's left foreshoe had a notch on the outer edge where a nail had been lost and not replaced. You, McBride? Holt asked. Bought from him. Holt cocked his head and considered the house, then the grave on the rise, then Thomas. You cut her down. Yes. Holt's smile unmeant. That was a warning, see? You remove a warning. Sometimes the warning has to be repeated. Thomas said nothing. Silence is speech if you use it right. Dry Creek's got ways, Holt. Went on. Out here, Apache come like smoke and leave like smoke. Folks spook. Men do what they have to keep their cattle and their kids. Circle the wagons. Make signs. He jerked his chin toward the patched roof where a buzzard had settled, and then thought better of it. If a man didn't understand, he might call a thing cruel that was just sensible. That what you call hanging a girl? Thomas asked. The words fell like tools onto a bench. Simple, made for work. Holt's eyes thinned. You got a pistol, he said quietly. We all got pistols. It's the world that does the hanging. I'm trying to keep it from hanging on to Dry Creek. The broad man mows. Thomas named the boots in his head shifted in the saddle with a creak of leather. He's got himself a soldier's posture, he told Holt, as if Thomas weren't there. Bluebelly. You can smell them. Soldier's a good thing, the thin one, the one Thomas had called Rucker in his mind, put in. Means he'll take orders when he hears them. Holt's one-sided smile returned, colder. Order is what we're offering, friend. That deed you got is just paper with McBride's runoff on it. This valley runs on something that don't wash in whiskey. You'll ride out now with your mule and whatever you can strap to it. You'll leave the keys you don't have and the rights you can't claim. Or you'll stay and learn what a warning looks like once men start repeating themselves. What? If I stay and start giving warnings? Thomas asked. Mo's single quotes S hand twitched toward his carbine. Holt lifted 2 fingers without looking at him, and Moses' hand stopped moving. You'll die fair, Holt said, conversational as if discussing fence wire. Fair and fast. The ground will take what's left and be no poorer for it. Thomas let his gaze drift, just for a second, to the notch on Holt's horse's shoe, to the dried tobacco stain on the yard boards near the post, to the scuffed boot prints that matched the 3 in front of him now. He brought his gaze back up like he was bringing up a bucket and looked Holt in the single working eye of that smile. "I paid $22 for this place," he said. "Seemed cheap at the time. Seems high now that I know the neighbors." Rucker barked out a laugh he couldn't hold in. Holt didn't laugh. He leaned forward in the saddle so that his shadow fell a little over Thomas's boots, and then drew back again. "You got a day," Holt said. "Sun goes down tomorrow, and if you're still warming that porch, the night will do what it does." He turned his horses, and the flanking men turned with him, because they were practiced, and because when Holt moved, the shape of things moved with him. As they rode off, Holt lifted his voice so it carried under the windmills, complaining. "McBride didn't tell you, I guess. Some parts of a ranch you don't want. You just bought them." They went the way Thomas had followed the tracks earlier, because of course they did. Nachu threw off the same print. Rucker's right toe scuffed. Moses' ruined heel left little crescents like a bad moon. Thomas stood until the dust was just the regular dust again, and the sound of them had thinned into the sound of everything else. He thought about following, about putting a rifle ball into a man's back and letting that be the end of it. But ends and middles have a way of trading places if you're not careful. He went to the porch instead and sat. He put his revolver on the table and took up a whetstone for the knife. The rasp and draw gave his hands work his mind could ride. He made coffee, the kind cowboys call thick, and drank it even though it was terrible. He filled the trough and worked the pump until the wind took over. He walked the fence line and counted posts that would need setting and wire that would need stretching. The ordinary labors laid themselves over the extraordinary like a blanket over a body. When the sun slid down the sky and laid its hand along the red bluffs, Thomas climbed the rise and sat by the cairn. He unpinned the red strip from the stick, retied it tighter, and set it again so it wouldn't flap itself into disappearance. He spoke without quite meaning to. "They came back," he told the stones. "They'll come again. I'll be ready. Next time, whether I ought to be or not." A hawk cut a clean line overhead. Coyotes tuned up far off as if practicing for a performance that would start full dark. The wind went easy. He felt the day climb off his shoulders. He stood and went back to the house, out in the dark, when a house is more opinion than structure. Small sounds carry. Under the floor, a mouse worked at a seed. Near the door, a cricket tuned its one note. Out in the yard, something a jackrabbit or a dream thumped and ran. Thomas lay on the floorboards, rifle within reach, hat over his eyes, and didn't sleep. The math of the thing wouldn't let him dot by dawn. Decision had hardened. He took the whiskey bill deed from his coat and folded it smaller, then smaller, until it fit under the floorboard beside the deer-hide bundle. He slid the board back into place and pressed his palm flat against it, as if to say to the house, "We've put 2 promises in you now. Keep them." He saddled the mule and slung the shovel, coiling rope the way cavalry taught him figure 8, and tied off to pay out clean. He filled the canteen Nettie had given him and hung it where his hand would find it without looking. He packed hardtack, jerky, coffee, rifle cartridges. The work steadied him. He walked out to the rise one more time. The red strip lifted and fell. He set a flat stone at the foot of the cairn and scratched into it with his knife awkward letters. That would weather down. Found here. A man can lie to himself in a dozen directions, but a stone has no appetite for lying. When the sun cleared the bluffs, he led the mule toward the wash to pick up the trail, because fighting blind is a good way to put yourself in the ground you just filled. He went slow where the sand told better truths, fast where the rock didn't care. He found where Holt had cut sign across the high shoulder, where Rucker had dropped a match head and ground it out with his heel, where Mose had spat and missed his own boot. He found a tuft of horsehair snagged on a catclaw and a twist of rawhide. Left where something had been tied and then hurriedly untied. The trail bent south by west, toward a notch in the bluffs that made a gate out of stone. Beyond that, country rough and folded as an old blanket. It was a place where a man could stash things he didn't want found. Or people. Thomas stood in the mouth of that notion and felt the old army feeling draw up inside his ribs, the one that says, "Here is a march, and here is your part in it." Turned back before he crossed the threshold of the notch. He'd seen enough for the morning. Tracks can age while you look at them. Sometimes you let them be and pick them up fresher later. Back at the ranch, he checked the pen, the door, the windows. He wedged a length of board along the inside of the door so it would jar it if someone leaned against it in the night. He set the spare rifle, a long pitted thing he'd found in the trunk, within reach of the window that faced the yard, and he sighted down it until the bead and the windmill lined up like two ideas agreeing. In the afternoon, he cut a switch of willow and practiced laying the rope in the yard, not because he expected to rope a rider off his horse, though that was a thing a man could do, but because the motion calmed him and gave his shoulders a job that wasn't carrying anger. He gathered dry wood and stacked it in a neat cord, a man's argument against chaos. Toward evening, a shadow crossed by the cottonwood and did not move like a hawk. He froze and let his eyes slide there slow. Nothing. Then the shadow moved again. Ripple low to the ground, wrong shape for cat, wrong for coyote. He waited until the air itself seemed to hold its breath. "Come on, then," he murmured. But whatever it was had no interest in being invited. He sat the second vigil on the porch. Steps, boots on the lower board, elbows on his knees. The land cooled. The sky threw its last color into the east, like it wanted to see how far it could carry. Somewhere a nighthawk made its lazy fall and rise, muttering. "You bought a ranch for $22, he told himself. You didn't know you were buying a war. He didn't know yet that wars come with witnesses you don't expect. He didn't know yet that the shadow by the cottonwood had eyes the size of a child's and fear to match. He only knew that men would be coming when the moon was next a knife. He sat and listened to the windmill talk and let the shadows lengthen around him until the house and the yard and the grave and the whole of his bargain lay within a single ring of dark his, for now. He swore his first oath of the new ownership there, where no one could hear him but the crickets and the dead. "Whoever tied that knot," he said, "will answer for it. If I have to ride into hell, I'll ask the way and keep riding." The wind shifted. Somewhere far off, horses answered each other, restless. Thomas laid his rifle across his thighs and settled his back against the post. Night took the light. The land breathed in. When dawn came again, no one had knocked, and nothing had moved the board by the door. But the day itself felt different, like a card face down that wants turning. The third dawn broke with a low, copper light. Thomas had been dozing on the porch, hat tipped over his brow, rifle across his knees. He woke not to sound, but to absence, the hush of the windmill blades stilled against the breeze. Even the mule had its ears pricked and rigid. He knew that kind of silence. It was the kind that gathers before artillery or ambush. He stood slowly, brushing the dust from his coat, eyes combing the edge of the cottonwood stand. A quiver of movement darted between the trunks, low and quick. Not coyote. Not deer. Smaller. Thomas stepped off the porch. "Come on out," he said evenly. "You've been watching long enough." No answer. The mule stamped once. Uneasy. He advanced with the patience of a man who has walked into ambushes before and come out the other side. The cottonwoods whispered overhead, giving no counsel. Then, in a blur of legs and tangled hair, a figure burst. From the brush thin, fast, a child. She made for the wash like a rabbit for its hole. Thomas's soldier reflexes sprang. He sprinted, covering ground in heavy, certain strides, and caught her by the waist as she tried to scramble over the bank. She thrashed like a wildcat, fists beating his chest, teeth flashing. "Easy," he barked, more command than plea. "I'm not here to harm you." She froze, breath heaving, eyes wide and black as obsidian. Her skin was the same copper tone as the girl he had buried. Her dress was ragged, dust-stained, her moccasins worn through at the toes. She could not have seen more than 10 summers. For a moment they stared at each other, her fear sharp as a knife between them. Then she spat out a word halting English. "No kill." Thomas loosened his grip at once, hands raised. "No kill, not me." She trembled, still crouched like a spring that might coil again. "What's your name?" he asked softly. She pressed her lips tight, then whispered, "Sonny." The name sat in the air like a prayer. Thomas nodded. "Sanny, mine's Thomas." "You're safe here." She did not answer, but watched him like he was a rattlesnake that might coil at any second. Then, in broken syllables, she forced out, "Sister?" "Here." His throat tightened. He knew, but he asked anyway. "Your sister?" Sonny nodded once, chin quivering. She pointed toward the house, toward the grave he had raised. "Yes," Thomas said, voice low. "I found her. I gave her rest." The girl's face twisted, pain too large for her small frame. She bit her hand to keep from crying, but the sound leaked out anyway, thin and keening. Thomas felt a hollow in his chest widen. He wanted to reach out, but touch can be as cruel as comfort if offered wrong. He simply knelt there in the dust, with her, until the storm inside her spent itself into silence at last. She looked up, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. "More," she whispered. "More what?" "Girls, taken, there." She thrust her arm toward the bluffs. Her hand shook. "Bad men." The words chilled him. His suspicion from the tracks, from Holt's thinly veiled warning, sharpened into certainty. "They're alive?" He pressed. Sonny nodded fiercely. "Alive. Cage." Thomas closed his eyes a moment. He thought of Holt's scarred face, his smug smile, his talk of warnings. The truth behind the so-called Apache curse was plain as blood on white cloth. Holt and his riders were not defending Dry Creek. They were taking children, using them, discarding them when they became inconvenient. "Why you here?" Sonny asked. Suddenly, her English hesitant, but sharp enough. "I bought this place," Thomas said, and it sounded foolish in his own ears. But maybe it wasn't me buying it. Maybe it wasn't buying me. She tilted her head, not understanding, but her dark eyes softened by a fraction. He took her back to the ranch house, gave her water from Nettie's canteen, and broke hardtack into crumbs so her small teeth could manage. She ate like a starved bird, quick and furtive, watching the door all the while. When she was done, he leaned on one knee and asked, "These men, Holt and the others, they come often?" Her gaze flicked to the door again, then back. "They come. Take, hit, tie." She tapped her wrists, showing rope burns like her sister's. "Sister fight. Sister die." The words landed like stones inside him. "I won't let them take you," he said. She stared, doubt plain. "They kill." Thomas nodded grimly. "Maybe, but not without a fight." That night he sat again on the porch, Sanny curled in a blanket. By the hearth inside, the stars blazed hard and white, indifferent what men did beneath them. Holt would come back, of that Thomas was sure. And when he did, he would not just be riding for land or intimidation. He would be coming for the girl who had slipped his snare. Thomas loaded his rifle with slow, deliberate hands. He thought of the oath he had spoken at the grave. Whoever tied that knot will answer for it. Now the oath had grown. He was no longer keeper of the dead alone. He was guardian of the living. He looked at the horizon where the bluffs cut the sky like jagged teeth and said into the night, "I'll bring them home, Sonny. Everyone." And from the shadows of the house, the child's small voice answered, fierce as flint, "We fight." The day of reckoning began quietly. That's how most reckonings do. The sun rolled up over the red bluffs like a molten coin. The air shimmered hot before noon, cicadas tuning their relentless song. Thomas had spent the hours mending his rifle, sling, checking the lashings on his mule, and teaching Sonny the only hand signs he knew from his soldiering days. Stop, wait, hide. She learned fast. Her eyes followed his every motion like a hawk's, but his mind wasn't on the mule, or the rifle, or even the girl at his side. It was on the cage she had spoken of, Holt's cage. Somewhere beyond those bluffs, children were penned like stock, waiting for whatever cruelty Holt and his riders had in store. He had seen men penned before Andersonville, Libby prison, camps, where sickness and cruelty walked hand in hand. He would not stomach another dot by mid-morning. He saddled the mule, packed hardtack and cartridges, and checked the revolver in its holster twice. Then he crouched by the fire pit where Sonny sat sharpening, a stick with more determination than skill. "I need you here," he said gently. "If I fall, you run east. Find Nettie in Dry Creek. Tell her who you are." Her jaw set stubborn. "No run. Fight," Thomas sighed. 10 years old, and already the war had pressed its seal into her. "All right," he conceded. "But fight. Smart. That means listening when I tell you." She gave a small, sharp nod. The ride to the bluffs, they set out at noon, riding into a world of glare and mirage. The trail Holt's men had carved was plain deep-hooved horses, careless ash from cigarettes, even a rag of cloth snagged on mesquite thorns. Thomas followed every sign with the precision of a soldier, scouting enemy lines dot by late afternoon. They reached the stone notch that cut through the bluffs like a doorway to some darker kingdom. Beyond it, the land folded into ravines and shelves of rock, a perfect place for outlaws to vanish or hide their sins. Thomas tethered the mule in a draw, then climbed with Sonny along a rocky ledge that overlooked a basin. Smoke curled from below. A camp. He pressed his belly to the rock and studied the scene. 3 tents clustered near a fire. 2 men sat drinking, rifles propped beside them. Another clean tack at the corral. And beyond Thomas's jaw tightened the pen. Rough logs staked upright in the ground, lashed with rope. Inside, 3 children huddled. Girls no older than Sonny. Holt was there too, unmistakable on his buckskin horse, Scar catching the last light. He barked orders as Mose and Rucker dragged a crate from one of the tents. Holt opened it and drew something out bottles, glinting amber in the firelight. Whiskey trade goods. Payment for children. Thomas's stomach turned cold. Someone was buying. Someone would come for the girls. He looked at Sonny. Her fists were balled tight, eyes fixed on the pen dot. He whispered, "Tonight. Fire and lead they." Waited until the sun bled itself out against the horizon. Shadows stretched long, the canyon cooling into purples and blues. Coyotes struck up their eerie hymn. Thomas moved first. He circled wide along the ridge, sliding down behind the corral where brush grew thick. He signaled Sonny to crawl the opposite side, toward the pen. She moved like smoke, low and silent. He checked the rifle, drew a breath, and stepped into the she. Open. The first shot cracked like thunder, dropping the man by the tack. Holt spun, shouting. Thomas fired again, and the second rider fell clutching his chest. Chaos erupted, men shouting, horses screaming, children crying. Sonny darted to the pen, knife flashing as she sawed at the ropes. "Go," she hissed in Apache, shoving the first girl through the gap she made. Bullets bit the dirt near Thomas's boots. Rucker had found his carbine. Thomas rolled behind a log, fired blind, heard a grunt of pain. Smoke and sparks from the thea. Fire clouded everything. Then Holt's voice cut through, furious and sharp. "Avery, you're dead already, soldier boy." Thomas rose, rifle leveled. "So are you, Holt." They fired near the same instant. Holt's shot tore splinters from the log beside Thomas. Thomas's bullet ripped Holt's hat clean off, grazing his temple. Blood streaked his face, but he stayed mounted, snarling. Mose charged from the side, swinging an axe. Thomas dropped the rifle, drew his revolver, and fired point blank. Mose spun and fell heavy, axe clattering from his grip. By then Sani had freed. All three girls, her small frame fierce as any warrior's. She shouted for them to run, and they scattered toward the rocks. Holt wheeled his buckskin, spurring hard to intercept. Thomas lunged, caught the horse's bridle, and dragged with all his strength. Holt swung a pistol down, but Thomas wrenched him half out of the saddle. They grappled, two men locked in fury, until the revolver went off wild into the dirt. With a final heave, Thomas pulled him down. Holt hit hard, rolled, and came up snarling, knife in hand. The fire painted them both in hell's colors. Holt slashed, the blade catching Thomas's sleeve. Thomas answered with his own knife, steel flashing. They circled, breath ragged, the night around them holding its breath. "You should have left." Holt spat. "You should have never tied that rope." Thomas answered. They closed. The fight was brutal, desperate, more brawl than duel. Holt cut Thomas's forearm. Thomas slammed his fist into Holt's scarred jaw. They fell together in the dust, knives locked. With a final surge, Thomas drove his blade home. Holt's eyes widened, then dimmed. He collapsed, the dust drinking his blood. Aftermath silence spread, broken only by the whimper of horses and the crackle of fire. The surviving outlaw had fled. Mose and Rucker lay still. Holt's body twitched once, then was quiet. Thomas staggered up, arm bleeding, breath heaving. He looked to the pen empty. The children huddled with Sani near the rocks, eyes wide but alive. He sheathed the knife, wiped blood from his face, and walked to them. "It's over," he said, though he knew such things are never truly over. Sani looked at him, fierce and proud. "We fight," she repeated. He nodded. "We fought, and we won." The stars burned overhead, sharp and endless. Thomas gathered the children, set the camp afire, and led them back toward the canyon where the land opened wide. Holt's empire of cruelty smoldered behind them, smoke curling into the night. The ranch still stood, waiting. A grave with a red ribbon still marked a promise. And though he had bought the land for $22, Thomas Avery understood the true price: blood, fire, and the burden of the living. He would carry it as long as it took.